bit crazy. Kind of the one.
Hello.
Hello.
Sorry, I accidentally started playing the meeting out loud to the office, so they couldn't have my headset again.
How are you guys?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm good. Recovered from KubeCon now, so
Same.
yeah, ready to go again.
That's the easiest one to recover from KubeCon.
Oh yeah, yeah. Oh, I had a look into the OpenFeature flag deployment with the operator. We need to make a quick change so that it doesn't bombard you with unnecessary startup flags because it'll probably cause an error, right?
Nice.
And that shouldn't be too difficult of a change to make. I'm just working on a POC for something else, and then I can just jump straight on that.
Yeah, no worries. It's no rush on that, but I was super interesting to have your feedback on it.
Yeah. Otherwise, we're starting OpenFeature flag, and then we're also smacking start -- URI onto the end, which is obviously going to cause an issue. So.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hello. How are you?
Can't complain. You're gonna take a day off tomorrow. Monday's a holiday in Austria, so it's the 4-day.
It's a holiday here as well. Me and my friends have all booked to go to a big villa in Greece, so that'd be nice.
Oh,
nice.
Yeah. Have some ouzo for breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
Oh gosh, that sounds great and yet terrible.
Oh yeah. Not looking forward to work a week on Monday. Oh no, it's a bank holiday again. Tuesday.
We'll need another week to recover.
Yeah. I'm just putting my body through it. Yeah.
Hey.
Hello.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
So, hey Todd, how's the jet lag again doing? I guess
It's less difficult going this direction, only because it hits different, right? So like now I'm just really tired. By the time I'm putting my daughter to bed at 8 p.m., I'm just like, oh, I'm also ready to sleep now too.
Actually, sounds quite nice.
That's me most days.
Right. Same.
Yeah, and I'm like ready to go at 5 in the morning the next morning.
good to know. I'll ping you. That way it's more Austria compatible. I'll start just pinging you at your 5 in the morning. See if it works. All right.
Okay, so we're one after. I guess we'll get started. I don't think Mike's gonna show today. He tacked on more travel after KubeCon like a madman. So I think he's just struggling to stay functional.
I'd like to just introduce myself quickly. Hey, I'm Jonathan from DevCycle, one of the co-founders and CTO over here. I think I introduced myself to a couple of you at KubeCon last week, and so I thought I'd join.
Good to see you. Yeah, we usually start with introductions. So anybody else who wishes to introduce himself, you can go ahead and just unmute and do that, or use an emote, whatever you like.
Hi, this is Yashwant. I spoke with Michael last month. I came to know about this through GSOC. So I'd like to try to fit in or blend in before I make any contributions and understand what's going on.
Hi, I'm Sharath. I met, I think, with Todd during KubeCon. I work as a SRE for payments provider in called Molly in Amsterdam, and we are working with introducing feature flags in our environment. And yeah, I'm looking for open source ones, and that got me started with OpenFeature, and I had a discussion with Todd, and here I am. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So I think that's all the new faces. Thanks everybody for joining. The agenda this meeting isn't too long. So it might be a short and sweet one, unless we kind of just kind of improvise, which sometimes that happens too. So we're welcome to do that. But I'll get started. I wanted to quickly debrief some of the KubeCon stuff.
Do we need a scribe?
Oh, that's a great call.
If it's going to be a short one, I totally won't volunteer.
Okay, thanks, Pete.
I'm kidding, but I will happy to volunteer unless anyone else wants to do it. Awesome.
Thanks for keeping me on track. Yeah, so I wanted to quickly go over KubeCon, just do a quick debrief. I guess that's my first point. I think it was really, really great. The first thing that kind of surprised me a bit, we had a maintainers meeting, which is something the CNCF just automatically set up for us. First thing in the morning on Tuesday, wasn't it? Or no, David, did you do that? I'm not sure, maybe that was you. Okay, so David did it, but regardless, it was first thing in the morning on Tuesday, so I wasn't expecting like a huge amount of attendance, particularly because some of the people who are already maintainers we knew weren't there yet. They were still in transit. So it ended up being less of a maintainer meeting per se, and more of a, I don't know, interested party meeting, I guess. There was a lot of people who weren't too familiar with the project there, but we basically packed out all the seats in the room. So that was surprising. I mean, it's more of a conference room. It wasn't like an amphitheater or anything like that. But most of the seats were filled to my memory, and there was a lot of kind of interest in the project from people who hadn't heard about it. And so we kind of did some basic introductions, and the thing I appreciated from that meeting was really getting use cases from people. And it was a validation of a lot of the things that we know to be interesting about the project for big enterprises. So the use cases we got were, we're just getting into feature flags. We're not really ready to commit to any vendor, but we're looking at them right now. And it would be great to be able to give our development team something basic right now so they could start. We heard that. We heard also though, like, you know, our org has internal solutions right now, but we don't have an SDK, and so that kind of thing as well. So it was, yeah, just a big validation of a lot of the stuff we already know. And I think we actually got some contributors out of it as well. The other takeaway there that was a consistent theme throughout all of KubeCon was people want Python. They want a Python SDK, and we don't have it yet, though we're very close. So that was again validated there. And then there's the booth. Go ahead, Pete.
Alpha person for the SDK, because we use Python in my day job, and we use feature flags a little bit. So happy to be a guinea pig if that would help. I don't know who's maintaining it.
Yeah, well, right now we have Hillary, as well as a new person whose last name I forget, Rob. Hillary Lipzig, Rob, and then Matt from Flagsmith. Although there's a few Matts from Flagsmith. Matt Ewell, I think is his last name. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, Ben.
Elwell, yeah, Elwell. But we have 3 Matts.
Yeah. So there's some Matt name spacing issues at Flagsmith.
Massive.
But yeah, yeah, so we had a great meeting too for the Python SDK, where we created basically a roadmap to 1.0. Actually, if you look in below the next point, there's a GitHub query. So if you basically click that link, you'll see all of the issues we've identified as required for a 1.0 release of Python. And some of them have already been knocked off, which is great. But we're not that far away. So yeah, that was kind of the output of that meeting. And then at the booth, we saw a lot of people interested in the project. We had a lot of traffic, and the people interested for kind of 2 main reasons. more along the lines of what I already mentioned. So either they're enterprise with multiple kind of homegrown solutions, possibly looking to migrate to a vendor, and yeah, then in other cases we're looking to get into feature flags but don't want to make a commitment with the vendor at this point. So we heard a lot of those. That was kind of one category, and the other category was Kubernetes. People with a deployment of Kubernetes, or who really like the Kubernetes native kind of artifacts, being really interested in flags as custom resources, which is obviously something that's kind of attractive at KubeCon, and something FlagD and kind of the OpenFeature operators, it can help them with. But I'd say it was actually more in the first category, a lot more people interested in just vendor neutral feature flags, either for onboarding or kind of consolidating. Yeah, we already kind of talked a little bit about Python, so that link is there. Pete, anyone else, if you are interested in contributing to the Python SDK, we could definitely use even more help there. So I'm feeling more confident than ever we have the right team in place now. Yeah, I think that's basically my update for KubeCon. So before I move on to the client stuff, does anybody have questions or comments or anything else they want to add?
Actually, Todd, that thing that you told me, I can't remember what the service was that you said people were using to shoehorn flag states into FlagD. Was it that was a really interesting thing? Can you remember? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Not quite. Refresh my memory.
You said that that people were starting to use, it was some other like simple key value data store or state management system in the Kubernetes ecosystem that people were using to that attached to FlagD, I think, or they were using it as like a provider, but it wasn't designed in any way to do like flagging.
Oh yeah, what was that? I think there was somebody at some point. I don't think it was mentioned. Yeah, somebody at some point mentioned they were using Open Policy Agent as a flag backend.
That was it.
That does that sound right?
Yeah, that was it. Yeah. I just thought it was really like people are doing like weird hacks to try and approximate something which I thought that struck a chord with me.
Yeah. So like basically somebody was using Open Policy Agent as a provider. I haven't actually seen that code, but I don't think it would be wildly difficult to implement. Yeah. I mean, certainly there's a lot of interesting, like that's kind of one of the interesting things about the project. You can basically have any kind of state store and use it as a backend. I mean, evaluation becomes a little bit complicated if you don't have the ability to kind of run arbitrary functions, although you can serialize those and run them in your provider if you want.
Were they using like Open Policy Agent to also kind of build the flagging rules though? Because I think I had a conversation with Justin about that as a potential like idea that maybe is a terrible idea or maybe not, but
the person I talked to who came to the booth said they were basically using it to store static stuff, but thought that it would be possible to embed rule sets in there like as well. It would be an interesting POC. Like it could be a really interesting blog post. Somebody was wanted to like experiment with it potentially. But yeah, it seemed kind of basic. It seemed like it was just POC level experimentation. And like I said, I haven't seen the code.
I don't know if this is the good time to bring this up. So regarding the providers, that was one of the discussions I was having with Todd as well. And I've created an issue for the feature, I guess. Because currently I think we don't have a lot of or stable these.
Sure, I think you're breaking up a little bit. Maybe you can turn off your video or something.
That would sync the flags from a small API or a UI, and I just created an issue for that. I don't know if this is the right setup, or do you want to look at it later or something like that?
I think I'll try and rephrase. Your internet seems more stable now, or the connection seems more stable now. But what I think I got from that was, yeah, I think we talked at KubeCon, and you were talking about some kind of alternate command and control potentially for flag D beyond really just the primitive stuff we have. Yeah, I mean that's definitely something that's possible. I think that there continues to be kind of this confusion over what the role of flag D is going to be in the organization. We talked at some point earlier, and I think the governance board really needs to kind of close the loop on this one, but there's been conversation about potentially moving flag D out of the OpenFeature org. And I think that's relevant because in some ways it is a vendor. So to continue to maintain neutrality, we may want to consider doing that. It's kind of like, to compare OpenTelemetry to OpenFeature, it's kind of like a Jaeger or something like that. So as it gets more feature rich, especially if we're going to attach things like a UI to it, we may want to break it out into a separate org. But I think that's a decision we need to make at probably the governance level of the project, and maybe involve the CNCF. But that's kind of my concern about that. I don't know if there's other opinions on it.
To clarify, when you say the org, you're primarily talking about the GitHub org rather than like an entirely new CNCF project?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, at the very least, the GitHub org, but it may need to be moved out into a separate CNCF project. I mean, the org is just an artifact in GitHub, but it may require separate governance to avoid conflicts of interest and that kind of thing. So, yeah, I'm not sure about that. I think that needs to be, again, something the GC really tackles. That's kind of my thinking on that. But I mean, as for additional extensions to flag D, I mean, I think there's a lot of value there. I don't know how much time I don't know how much time or resources we have as a project to like make that fully featured. I mean, I don't think it's ever going to be like an enterprise alternative, because I can't see people contributing things like SAML integration, for example. And that's the type of thing you'd want if you were going to make like a full feature rich UI. It's one thing to kind of integrate with Kubernetes because things are fairly basic. And then it becomes more complex if you're trying to do like a whole enterprise ready UI with RBAC and that sort of thing. I think that's probably beyond the scope of a reference implementation.
I agree with all the stuff you're saying. And I think the analogy with Jaeger is a very apt one. But, a lot of people build stuff on top of Jaeger, as far as I understand it. I'm not like super deep in the OpenTelemetry world, but yeah, just because it doesn't have all that stuff. I think that's why it's a nice complement to the commercial offerings, because anyway, it's a longer conversation, I suppose.
Okay. I think I got the answers that I was looking for. Thanks for that. Yeah.
For the flag D conversation, is there something we have to get scheduled with the governance board then? Because it's definitely been a question that's popping up kind of, historically. So yeah, it would be helpful, I think, to know if we can actually get that scheduled and get to a decision on it.
I can put it on the agenda for the next time we meet. We've I think it's a reasonable statement from Todd that like it's kind of like something we've discussed, but we haven't kind of gotten to a conclusion on. So I can bring it up.
Do we just to add to that? Do we all know what we're talking about in terms of what is it like as it currently stands, or as a separate project, or are there, I don't know, things in between, or is it just one of two options that everyone's clear on, or are there other options as well?
I mean,
think, oh, sorry.
go ahead, David.
I was just gonna say, I think like looking at other projects, there was really the two options that came up. One thing is if it goes, so the simpler solution is having, well, simpler in a way, like is having, if you have the sub project, it stays within, you can't have a different governance committee, but you also don't have to go over the whole sandbox application again. If instead it becomes a completely separate project, you have to reapply for the whole sandbox, which like CNCF is usually quite busy, let's put it like that. And so it can take a bit for it to get like readmitted as a sandbox project. Like it could take even a year sometimes. Other
so my
options in
feeling
between.
is,
Yeah, sorry,
go
hadn't seen
ahead,
anything
David.
else. No, that's pretty much it. I was just gonna say we hadn't really seen other options in between because, yeah, otherwise it could be, I don't know, just complicated.
I mean, I don't want to bias everybody with my, the way I see it. So take this with a grain of salt. But my opinion is that the most important part of OpenFeature is the vendor neutrality, the SDKs, that whole kind of ecosystem. Flag D is very practically useful when you're doing demos, so because you don't have to involve like, I mean, whenever we were doing our demo at KubeCon, for instance, we used Flag D, but we also would then switch to various vendors to demo them. So we were switching to Flagsmith, we were switching to CloudBees, we were switching to LaunchDark, and just showing the vendor neutrality. But when people are just getting started, if they want to see like a full kind of featured solution in terms of user targeting and stuff like that, not having to like sign up for something is obviously valuable. That's kind of really, as a neutral kind of demo, Flag D is really useful there. But I don't really feel strongly that Flag D even necessarily needs to maintain its sandbox status, because it's not the heart of the project. The heart of the project are the vendor neutral SDKs, the specification, all that stuff. It's an implementation. I'm totally happy to see it grow and flourish and become its own thing, however that goes. But I don't feel like super strong about it being anywhere on the CNCF landscape in a hurry. I think it would get there anyway if it was its own project. That's my feeling. Yeah, and like I said, take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah, and I can say from like what I've seen with it, I'm happy to see it grow, and I think it helps people get started with feature flagging in those use cases easily too. Like the concern I had around it was, like that OFEP around providing the providers through Flag D, that impacts how, like, if we aren't supporting, or if we have more features than is just in what Flag D offers through OpenFeature, that SDK is then abstracted away, which is impactful for us. And if we support the project, which we want to continue to, by default, if Flag D is in the project, it's kind of hard to have the conversation of like, hey, we support OpenFeature, but this one part of Flag D, we don't agree with the implementation if it ends up that way in any certain cases. So we end up in like a split kind of conversation. And that's, I think, the only worry I have from that side.
Yeah, I think that reason, as well as others, are kind of why I would kind of favor separation of the two projects. But I'm not. Yeah, I'm open to further discussion on that.
Dan, have you got an example of how that might be limiting? I can't think of an example of how that might be limiting.
The track call, for instance. So we support experimentation if it's implemented through, or we also have the listeners, which is an OFEP now.
Right.
So if neither of those went through, but someone wanted to use OpenFeature, but really wanted these specific features from the SDK, they can no longer access it because the SDK would be implemented in a sidecar, which, in one pattern. And not saying that these are all definitely going to come to pass, or, a lot of this goes through a process, but that's just where you can see there's possible concerns around the functionality, and it's then going for what's an open feature only, and they don't even have an option to use these other calls then.
Yeah,
And
I would like to echo that. Like we've been working on some open feature integrations for DevCycle, and the same thing, like the tracking endpoints and for events, and not having sort of how it's modeled, and hey, you don't really have access to the sort of the underlying client like DevCycle SDK unless you sort of host that yourself is a bit odd. So there's a couple things like that we've noticed as well. But yeah, the tracking and a couple of the more experimentation features, you kind of get limited out through the open feature interface.
Yeah, I mean, I think as far as tracking, that's something that we're open to discussing further. The problem is that there's at some points there's an impedance mismatch between the feature set of some of the tools and others, right? So not every tool offers tracking. So then, there's a question of, well, is that something we want to get into the business of doing? Maybe. I mean, there could be, for instance, one of the things we discussed at an early point in the project is kind of segmenting out tracking so that you can set a distinct tracking provider, which may or may not be the same underlying provider that does your feature flags and abstracts kind of similar functionality, or functionality in a similar way. But then you could say mix segment up with CloudBees or whatever, since CloudBees doesn't have that feature. That was something we discussed earlier, but yeah, I don't think we've gotten there yet.
I mean, I think it's definitely an interesting thing to think about, not necessarily the tracking thing specifically, but how does the SDK provide the right extension points so that a vendor can do the things they want, like, so that vendors or so on one hand vendors, but also kind of application integrators, like people who are doing something complex inside some big enterprise, can extend open feature in ways that we haven't planned for or don't want to support because it's kind of outside the scope of the project. Like I very much agree with you, Todd, about not wanting to take on too much and kind of keep the focus kind of narrow and deliver a lot of value in that narrow area. But if we don't provide it good extension points and like kind of think about that thoughtfully, then it's going to make it really challenging for, I mean, sounds like makes it challenging for vendors right now to kind of really get behind open feature.
Yeah, I think that kind of extensibility is definitely stuff we need to work on more.
Is there like,
I mean, at the end,
I mean, maybe this is too much of a meaty topic to get into right now, but I would maybe, I don't know, maybe Todd, you already kind of get exactly what Jonathan and Daniel are saying. I'm a little bit, I would love to hear more about the details of like what I guess what is the SDK not doing that is kind of interfering with that ability to do tracking or analytics, but also ideally B, like what should we add if you have some bright ideas. But maybe I don't want to take us on too much of a tangent on this call.
A couple of things that just as like I'm in the middle of like implementing one at the top of my head of like, we have functions for like grabbing all variables, right? That are like, there's certain use cases where people want to grab all variables or all experiments that our SDK has. And so those functions are used pretty frequently by our customers, and we can't really expose that through the current API as far as I understand. I've just been looking at the Node one, another one of my engineers has been working on the Go one, but yeah, a couple things like that are things as well that we aren't really able to expose through the open feature API right now.
Is there like, would it be, what would be the challenges with having kind of like the feature flagging stuff in via the open feature API, and then that other stuff just as a separate thing that is, disconnected but accessible?
And that's, I think, where the question is, and like you're saying, it's a pretty meaty topic to get into, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know that there is a problem there. The only thing I was raising, and this is just getting back to like why we see Flag D is preferring to move it to a separate project, is because like it doesn't do that today. So maybe in the future, but also just the way our SDK works is usually locally in memory. And there's trade-offs around that. So I think we can definitely talk more on, you know, what else could be offered around it, but that was just specifically for like what we saw with OFEPs for Flag D and it being in the project overall is really where my questions and
Got it.
like having to support it come in to begin with for now.
Got it.
Yeah, specifically,
makes sense.
I think Jonathan mentioned events. Events is something that actually was the last thing I wanted to talk about. We do have 2 open PRs to the spec right now, which I think are basically critical. One is initialization and shutdown, and one is events. And those are relevant, especially to, well, they're relevant to the client, but they're also relevant to the server. So I consider them part of our client roadmap, but they would need to be, and those would be implemented in server side implementations as well. So you could subscribe to events. Just about every SDK that I'm familiar with supports that, and I think it's hugely important. And then the other thing that I think you're referring to is what we've referred to in the past is bulk evaluation. We chose not to implement bulk evaluation intentionally, kind of at the recommendation of a few vendors. Yeah, and it's something we could definitely come back to and revisit if there's more interest. But yeah, we did kind of choose not to do that. At the end of the day, like I think all abstractions are leaky, and right, OpenFeature is an abstraction, so there's going to be leaks. And so when you choose to use it, there's going to be parts of underlying SDKs that you don't have full access to. And we have to make, as maintainers, we have to make intelligent decisions over how leaky we want that abstraction to be versus how complex the solution gets and maintenance gets and the specification gets, right? I'm more of a conservative, less is more person when it comes to stuff like that. But maybe too much sometimes. Yeah, that's my take on that one. And I guess that's about it for me, because I've kind of mentioned the client stuff and the event and init shutdown. I'd love feedback on those. There's been a lot of good feedback already, but yeah, those 2 PRs that are mentioned there in the notes, 179 and 182, are I think really important for our client, as well as just general features that I think we really need. Yeah, that's about all I had.
One question I had, if we have time, was just about like the focus of the project. Seems, at least from my initial impressions, to be more back-end focused, like on back-end use cases versus like client-side use cases like web SDKs and mobile SDKs and things like that. I would say our customers are lean probably more 50-50, and a lot of, basically all of our customers use us in some way across both their backend and front end, be it mobile or web. So just interested to hear sort of what the project thinks of that, and like, are we pushing towards sort of more client side SDKs at some point, or is that something that's kind of open for future thought?
That's really been my main focus over the last couple months. So both the draft PR, the spec PRs that I mentioned contribute to that, because I believe that both initialization and shutdown, as well as event hooks, are kind of crucial for client usage. And then the last one is like the static versus dynamic context. So Pete has a really great blog post that I'll ask him to link in the notes, that kind of goes over our thinking in terms of client. We also have, if you look in both the PRs that I mentioned, you can see in our playground, I've implemented based on our experimental web SDK, which is published as an experimental module. I've implemented 5 web client providers So Flagsmith, CloudBees, LaunchDarkly, Split. I'm missing one of them. Anyway, I think there's 5 I've implemented, including one that works with FlagD. Actually, that's the 6th. So you can take a look at those. I mean, they work. You can do client-side feature flagging. That's what we demoed at KubeCon. It was all of the kind of UI-ish flags were all using the experimental JavaScript SDK, and then we had a backend flag that was using our Node.js backend. But I'd say from a spec perspective, where most of the project energy is going right now, besides developing like some Python and other SDKs. Yeah, I think we need as much feedback there as possible. If you're looking to contribute ideas into that, I would definitely start with Pete's blog post, because I think that like philosophically captures what we're thinking, and then you can look at some of those implementations in OFEPs and PRs.
Yeah, I think
happy to take a look.
I think that the TLDR, to kind of like maybe answer your original question, Jonathan, is the initial focus was on server side, and we kind of intentionally didn't focus on client side for that the initial kind of release of the spec, and then we have subsequently turned our focus to the client side and are getting pretty darn close at this point to I think very, very close to having that full from a spec perspective, like the full thing built out, and then it's just a case of getting all of the providers lined up to support all of the, it's a whole new set of tech stacks, right? Because even if it's JavaScript, it's like a whole different tech stack, and then there's iOS and Android and blah blah blah.
Cool. Yeah, happy to help. Try to help with the client side of things.
One thing that I think we like help on all of it is very gratefully received. I think I've said this before, but Todd's probably sick of me hearing it because I've said it on a bunch of kind of interviews with vendors and stuff. But like getting feedback from vendors is like super useful, because vendors see a lot more of like what people are doing in the wild than we have access to. So you understand the use cases and the gotchas and all that stuff a lot more, and like kind of harvesting all of that hard-won experience and using it for good is part of what we'd like to do. Specifically, I think a place where I feel like we've not had as much input or experience is around the mobile area. I don't know if anyone else, maybe I'm speaking out of turn, but it feels to me like definitely for me, my focus is, or my experience is way more on like client-side JavaScript than Android or iOS. And when we have talked to folks about mobile stuff specifically, like Justin's helped us out a lot there. We're talking with folks at eBay. There's some stuff that's just not obvious unless you have like kind of like slogged through the trenches. Like I think we heard some stuff about LaunchDarkly, and when we talked to LaunchDarkly about kind of needing to be a lot more respectful of network and battery and stuff like that, which just isn't obvious until you've slogged through it a little bit. So that would be particularly.
Yeah, I've been slogging through mobile SDKs for about a decade with Taplytics for A/B testing, and now with DevCycle for the last couple of years. So yeah, have lots of experience with mobile and working with some large companies there. So happy to help.
I think like in my head, what you're talking about, the leakage, Todd, there's going to be more. I just think there's going to be more leaks on the client side, just because like just for example, yeah, like our client side JavaScript SDK has like probably 3 times the number of initialization parameters than Python one. Just that's happened organically as well. We never sat down and designed it like that. It's like there were good customer use cases for those 3 times as many things. So it's definitely going to be more challenging. And yeah, so my thoughts are, yeah, like aiming at like the common denominator is possibly going to be a little bit smaller, and that's going to make it a little bit less effective. that would be my approach.
Yeah, I mean, that doesn't surprise me. I think that's one of the reasons why we kind of started with server and built up the project, and now we're venturing into client, especially particularly web. I mean, I'm optimistic that if we get our concepts right, we can try and push as much vendor specific stuff, especially around initialization, where I think there's a lot of differentiation into provider territory, because it's very easy to configure your provider and your initialization in a unique way, and then kind of plug in OpenFeature so that the actual application author, as we refer to them, is focused on the actual OpenFeature API, but the configurator and the kind of the integrator are focused on those bits that are very vendor specific. So we're minimizing the kind of code that has to, we're localizing and centralizing all the code that's going to be very vendor specific in terms of initialization and stuff like that, and then letting developers kind of run wild with a consistent API. I think that's the vision, that's the hope, but we need to get the abstractions right. And like one of the key things is like the static context. So far we've seen, at least on the client, you're generally working in the context of one user, and then changes to the state are slightly less frequent and sometimes involve chatter. But there's at least like this kind of this state that's mutated, that's kind of maintained and mutated across application actions, whereas the server is like completely dynamic, right? The context of the request is changing with every single HTTP request if it's a web server, that kind of thing. So I think that's one of our biggest assumptions, and if that generally seems to work, and so far it seems to be working, I'm optimistic.
Yeah, I would point out probably one of the most important things for client side to get right is the caching mechanisms, because different SDKs handle those caching mechanisms differently. They're very critical to like how the flags that you get evaluated on the client side, and updates to values. I think because of those caching mechanisms and how you may not want to delay the start of an application, you may want to use cache values for your flags at the start of the application, then they may need to update later on in the lifecycle of the application. You might need to get an update mechanism into the spec as well. So those are some of the things off the top of my head.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I'm kind of relieved to hear that, because that's what we kind of identified as the main challenges. So we've tried to create hooks into the API that allow you to kind of control and react to those things, like react to changes in that state, in the cache state, and control when that state is updated, and that kind of thing. So yeah, I think we're on track there, but that would be the kind of thing that's great to have validated.
Mm-hmm.
There's just one other thing in my head, which is, I don't know, from our experience anyway, a lot of folk like React Native and Flutter are mega popular, and I feel like unless you're writing like a huge mass consumer B2C application, it's kind of less common to see native Swift and Kotlin applications on mobile devices. So then I'm sort of thinking like, do we put more energy behind like the JavaScript one rather than a Swift one, and then see if we can try and replicate that? Or, might there be like impedance mismatches between those two platforms that only become apparent when you start to implement? So that's a question as well, because there's like from a paradigm point of view, like generally, if you squint, generally the server side languages and runtimes and stuff generally work in a very similar way, whereas like we had a problem with Flutter where they were suddenly, you could target web, and then that broke, but a bunch of libraries broke because they either did or didn't expect a web browser to exist. It's like crazy. So that landscape is moving a lot more than like Java, right? Like, so yeah, there's like way more dragons now on client side, way more.
And with both of those platforms, you can either integrate with the native SDK, so you can either do like a bridge between React Native and your native iOS and
Right,
Android
yeah.
SDKs, or you can do it all in JavaScript.
Yeah.
But for certain scenarios, it actually makes a lot of sense to use the native. As a vendor, like for us, it actually makes a lot of sense to do bridges to the native code, but it might not make sense for OpenFeature to do that, to just integrate with the JavaScript side of things.
I
So
hadn't even thought of
that's
that.
something
Yeah,
that might be like both
that's like a
Flutter
massive
and React
question
Native,
as
you can do
well.
that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I would echo the thing that Todd said, but I think that we have a kind of a small enough, kind of clean enough interface between the SDK and the provider that a lot of that complexity we can kind of push into provider space. And as long as there's like 2 or 3 like kind of like interaction points between the running OpenFeature SDK and the provider, and like the amount of stuff, particularly like the amount of kind of state that we're trying to manage, going back to that caching thing that you were saying, Jonathan, like the amount of kind of state and that stuff that we're trying to manage is I think is almost as small as we can make it, so that the provider can figure that out and decide whether that, you know, whether that's running in, whether the state is running on, you know, is stored in JavaScript or native runtime, and where that kind of like calculation is being made as to where to evaluate the flag. I think initially when we started talking about the client side stuff, I advocated for OpenFeature doing more, and I think Todd did a good job of kind of pushing it more towards that very kind of skinny layer of a standard API on top of the providers, and the providers that are kind of still holding almost all of the complexity, which I think is the right approach given how like all of this variety that we're talking about. And on top of that, every vendor has very subtly different semantics around how state changes happen. For example, like what like the thing about loading, you know, what's the state of the flags as an app is booting up. I think every vendor is going to do it slightly differently in terms of like, do you use the last value you saw, or do you wait to provide a value, or do you allow the user to decide which of those mechanisms you use? Like it's all there's so much complexity there that essentially we just punt on it and say like, just let us know once once the flag value's changed, and we'll pass that on to the client.
Yeah, I think it's more like our main concern, to basically put what Pete just said a different way. Our main concern is to present an idiomatic API to the application author, not to solve complex problems for the provider. Yeah. The provider knows how they want to do their communication, how they want to do their caching. What we want to do is, you know, provide the necessary hooks and levers and knobs to configure that correctly, and then present the application author with an idiomatic API that makes sense for their language, their runtime. And that's really where that thin layer comes in. We're just kind of designing that API that reasonably abstracts as much as possible. But I was interested to hear from Ben, and actually to some degree some of the people at KubeCon, that for mobile it might be more practical to even in terms of the SDKs and those idiomatic APIs, it may be more beneficial for us to release, say, Dart for Flutter or React Native SDKs ahead of Kotlin or Swift, just because more people are kind of writing mobile apps in that land potentially. I mean, frankly, a lot of it comes down to where our maintainers and volunteers are going to live.
Yeah, like I think if you're talking hobbyist projects, it's definitely those languages. But if you're talking like there's still a good amount of native development for like for companies that are buying sort of our vendor products, right? So yeah, I would say like most of the smaller startups and hobbyist projects who sign up for us for free are using one of those languages for sure.
That's an interesting data point as well. I mean, because the one thing that we have seen is that people, the people most interested in OpenFeature are generally, in my view, not hobbyists. It is more enterprise because they're looking for migration paths. They're looking for no vendor lock-in. That's how it seems, at least, but that could be a little bit of sampling bias on my end. Okay, well, we're almost at time. I think we can call it unless there's anything else anybody wants to talk about.
I've got a random question. I've been kind of like eagerly waiting for the client-side web stuff to be ready enough that to build like a React. What's the word I'm looking for? Not agnostic. What's the opposite of agnostic? Idiomatic, I guess. Like a React, like an idiomatic React SDK on top of OpenFeature. What's your opinion, Todd, on when I could kind of just start? I guess, A, do you think I should just start doing that now? And B, would it make more sense to release that just as release that within the auspices of the OpenFeature umbrella, or whether I should just release it as just like a little standalone thing for now?
I'm reasonably confident that we're approaching a client abstraction that works. Yeah. So I think you could even try it now and see.
Maybe I just try it now under my own brand. I don't know what I'm saying. Like just under my own GitHub, my personal GitHub, and then we can move it, because I think we did that with a couple of other little OpenFeature contributions.
I'll see if I can get someone playing with the Next.js version as well.
Yeah.
I do have one thing I want to talk about, which is, or if we're done with that topic, sounded like we were. Every time the spec changes, we renumber like 80% of all the numbers, which makes it impossible to link to things in any sort of stable way unless you like pin it to a commit. Does that seem broken? Should we think of other ways to solve this problem?
Yeah, I don't like it. I think I don't know if you've looked at my most recent spec PRs, but I don't think they do that. There's the one that's a draft that has the big static context thing. But I think one of the things we made a mistake on earlier, personally, is that we didn't segment the spec enough. And I tried to kind of do that retrospectively, which caused some number shifting. But I think that we have enough sections now that it's not going to be as bad going forward. I would like to stop doing it personally. I agree.
Okay. All right. I'll do some renumbering.
What was that?
I said, I think I need to do some renumbering. The thing I think I heard you say is that what exists now is probably fine because it's segmented enough that
I think, I don't know. I mean, so with both the PRs that are, I think with both the existing spec PRs, like the events and the initialization one, I think that it's only adding new numbers. I could be wrong. I'll have to go and double check, but I don't think we're shifting any existing requirements. I could be wrong, but I don't believe we are.
So I'm looking at this set a single provider thing because that OPTEP just got merged for client spec matchups that I need to add something effectively right here. 1.1.3 would be the logical place for that to be, which means I need to replace 3, 4, 5, 6.
Yeah, so what I think, this is, I guess, what I've tried to do is I would make a section, like maybe make this a section and then add a 1.151, 1.152 under here that are your additional points. Obviously we can't do that like infinitely. But that's kind of the other option is obviously to add it at the end of this, even though there's a little bit of a gap, like there'd be some somewhat less related content in other numbers. You could append them towards the end, and I don't really think that's much of a problem. I'm okay with either of those solutions, but I do agree with you. I don't want to keep thrashing the numbers if possible.
The other option would be to move away from numbers.
Yeah, that's true.
I was going to say the same thing, at least for like linking or referencing. I mean, you could link to kind of the semantic thing, like the like make links to the words instead of referencing 1 point whatever or dot whatever.
That's what I was kind of trying to mention earlier when I was talking about is Justin, if you share your screen again, I've tried to topically separate things recently so that you can link to concepts more than numbers. So like, see, there's if you scroll down, I think there's an example. There's an unnumbered section, I believe. There's some unnumbered sections, headings. Maybe there isn't in section 1, but I've tried to add them in a few places where there's more like a conceptual section that doesn't actually have a number. Yeah, there's a good example. I've tried to do stuff like that in a few places, which maybe helps. But I mean, I would be okay with removing numbers. Numbers just make it seem very specification-y and make it very easy to reference an exact point. Like if you're saying this violates such and such point, you can easily reference the number and everybody's on the same page.
Yeah.
I definitely
I'll think through
wanting to, like, when it comes down to that actual kind of conversation of like, what are we talking about here? Like the whole point of a spec is to be unambiguous and very clear. And if we started saying like this violates like that part of the spec where we talk about blah, 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 then it's just way less useful. But to that point, like that only works if the numbers are consistent, because otherwise you go back in history and it's like, oh, this violates 1.7 dot whatever. And like, wait, that doesn't matter. Well,
yeah, see it like HTML has IDs like this, where you have to be unique within the document, but you don't have to be ordered. It's not a need for order there. I'll do some thinking about how this will change things. I know it's going to break a lot of the hooks that we like, a lot of the things we have built around this. I'm curious how the Gherkin stuff, if the Gherkin stuff would be affected at all. I know that the test framework that I have in Java is reliant on those. And so I'll need to think through that.
I mean, isn't
the Gherkin framework is not. The Gherkin framework is plain English that matches basically section 1, but it's all high level enough and doesn't directly relate to any of the spec points. Like it doesn't specifically tie to a number. We just implemented in .NET, by the way, which went really well, but it's not attached to sections. I think the numbers are mentioned in numerous unit test suite, like not end-to-end test suites, but unit test suites. I think Java has the most rigorous validation, like you're mentioning, Justin, but the other kind of SDK test suites just reference the numbers.
All right, I might make a note up for it. File.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Cursed it, Todd, by saying this will be a short one. I thought I was going to
yeah.
duties. What the
Went
heck?
all the way to the end. Yeah.
It was good though. Like, I mean, really good, like some really good topics, right? So yeah, obviously.
Yeah, I guess having a short one that's open-ended just means the most difficult topics get serviced.
Yeah, which is good.
Okay.
Alrighty.
I guess that's it. Thanks again, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.